Welcome to Voices of GFLI, the podcast where we hear directly from members of the Global Feed LCA Institute. In this series, we explore how trusted environmental data is shaping a more sustainable future for the animal feeds industry. Our guests share how they use the GFLI database in practice, how it supports their sustainability goals, and why credible, consistent metrics matter more than ever. This is the Voices of GFLI, where data, insight, and impact come together.
I'm Richard Proffitt. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of the Cool Farm Alliance. Cool Farm Alliance is a not-for-profit membership organisation that's looking to quantify environmental impact at farms for data to feed through the supply chains for supply chain reporting, but also as a decision support tool to help farmers become more resilient and sustainable. I think organisations like GFLI become really important. So it's a central point that the feed industry can provide its data through, and it should act as a sort of credibility check and balance on that data so that the database that's provided we can rely on as being a credible source of information for the feed data that we can then incorporate into the calculation tools like the Cool Farm tool. So again, as well, because we've got the feed industry providing that data, then there's also a function then for GFLI to act as a sort of arbitrator in terms of the performance of those feed companies. So by being able to compare, contrast, and sort of see the distribution of the environmental impact, the emissions or other impacts that the different feed suppliers are creating, then they can use that as for their own internal benchmarks to help them identify opportunities for improvement. Cool Farm was created over 15 years ago, originally as an Excel spreadsheet calculator at the product level at farms, so that the food and beverage supply chain could quantify their agricultural commodities that became ingredients in their products, and they wanted to understand the carbon footprint of that. Over that 15 years, the original carbon footprints have evolved to include biodiversity and water metrics, and it's all moved from an Excel spreadsheet into online. And so it's now a digital platform that covers annual crops, perennial crops, livestock systems for that environmental footprint. We also provide API connections, so the Cool Farm calculation engine can be used within third-party digital platforms. And as a result, the Cool Farm is used in over 150 countries around the world and has become the sort of de facto standard industry approach for those environmental assessments at farm level across the food and beverage sector and across the world, across a range of crop commodities and livestock commodities. Chain reporting acts as a decision support tool for farmers. So when a farmer enters their primary input data, the calculation provides results that provides the hotspots for their sort of carbon or biodiversity opportunities that sit within farm. And so they can use that to inform the farm management plan or the decision making they use on farm to help them make improvements, reduce costs, and make the farm more resilient. Okay, so the Cool Farm calculation uses a combination of primary calculations using primary data sets, but also draws on third-party databases. And the GFLI dataset is one of those credible third-party datasets that we use within the Cool Farm calculation. So when a farmer is completing a cattle assessment, we have a couple of different approaches for the way they calculate feed. So they can calculate their own feed production if they're growing their own feed crops, but if they're not and they're buying in feed crops as a feed, then they can do that either as a sort of dry matter intake or a herd average for the amount of feed that has been consumed by the herd during the assessment period. It's in those latter two where we then take that data and use it against the GFLI data set. So in completing the assessment, the farmer will say what feed types they've used and how much they are, and then we will use the GFLI data to work out the carbon dioxide, nitrous oxides, and sort of methane emissions, so the disaggregated emissions associated with that feed production that's associated with that assessment. Cool Farm tool will also then go on to calculate enteric emissions and things like that as well as part of the broader assessment. But specifically, we're looking at the production emissions for the feed that's been brought in. So I think I don't know if it's unique, but one of the powerful things of the Cool Farm is the ability to be able to use the GFLI data if you're using bought-in feed, but equally being able to, if you are growing your own feed, to be able to calculate your own emission factor for the feed you've grown, that's then feeding into the cattle assessment. I don't know whether that feature exists in other tools, but having that flexibility on approach means that the Cool Farm tool can be applicable to different farming systems and different geographies, and is therefore global. And that is very useful for the international supply chain companies who want to use a standard tool, standard calculation approach, but has the flexibility to be able to handle those different farming systems depending on where they're sourcing from. Cool Farm calculation methodology is constantly evolving as the science evolves. So we're forever improving it, both in terms of functionality and sort of scientific calculation methodology. And I think because of that, then what that also then means is the methodologies that should be used to calculate the feed emissions need to be updated routinely as well. So there needs to be this constant update to the GFLI dataset to reflect adoption of more sustainable practices, which will knock on to the emissions associated with the feed. We will always continue scope growth, if you like, within the Cool Farm calculation methodologies. So, we'll bring in other livestock typologies to come in, and so there'll be different feed types that are associated with the different sort of classes of livestock, and so we will need that to keep up with where we go. I think we need to make sure that sort of GFLI approaches and calculating methodologies that are used to determine the emission factors for the feeds stay up to date with the various guidance and standards that are evolving, whether it's Greenhouse Gas Protocol, or SBTI, or the new land sector removals guidance for land use change and carbon sequestration. All needs to be reflected into those emission factors. And we need to also then sort of factor in additional feed properties, not just the carbon dioxide or CO2e, needs to sort of any of the other sort of elements, the feed additives, the protein contents of the feeds, all of these sort of things need to be available in the dataset and maintained in updated GFLI so that the dataset coming into our calculation tools can be as up to date as possible. So I think it'll be bringing in branded sort of feed data into the data set will be useful, particularly for market relevance, and it's easier for the end user, to recognize the brand than necessarily it is for certainly compound feeds, right? So standard singular feeds are pretty obvious and easy for people, but the compound feeds where the feed companies are providing specific mixes that's specific to them, or specific sourcing qualities, sourced feed ingredients from a particular geography, certified no deforestation or whatever is associated with that brand. That then becomes really useful to have, because if people are investing in some of these environmental qualities that might be coming with a product, being able to identify that within the branded data will be useful. I think the challenge is, though, the methodology and quality of the assessments derived by the companies needs to be verified so that the data that's coming with that branded piece is being independently checked and is known to be credible. And there's a role for GFLI to set the standards for how that process is, to verifying the data, checking it's all good, and keeping it up to date. Because again, every year, those assessments will change because they might have to switch, changing sourcing location, they may change the compound mix, even though it's the same brand. All of that stuff needs to be updated and maintained and easily communicated. And the second element of this within the GFLI database, it's going to be critically important to provide unique identifiers to each of these elements, whether it's the branded data sets or the sort of standard feed items. Each needs to have its own independent unique ID so that when databases get updated over time, it's easy to correlate the continuity in those feed types through those updates, because otherwise it's very difficult for us to say, well, row 47 on this data set is row 38 on the previous one. It becomes a bit of a nightmare. So that sort of data continuity and traceability over time series becomes really important with this. So it's critically important for Cool Farm to have access to good quality, credible third-party data sets. So GFLI is critical to that in providing that data set. Now, a challenge is the GFLI data set is just one of many that we have to have access to. And on top of that, we have our own primary calculators that are also turning primary data sets into emissions that go into our calculation. So I think a piece from that license to factor in is it can't become too expensive, because we're a not-for-profit. We're on a similar sort of funding mechanism to GFLI itself. So if the GFLI database itself becomes too expensive and the licensing becomes too expensive, then it might be that we can't afford it, and therefore we'll have to look for other sources. So I think the purpose of GFLI needs to be really factored into its licensing piece, so that it's a credible channel to allow that feed data and the feed industry to run or get its data to the marketplace for inclusion into tools like ours as a decision support tool for farmers, rather than necessarily a excessively money generating data opportunity for someone. Cool Farm crop calculation can be used by feed producers to calculate the emissions or the environmental impact of the feed crops that they're growing. That effectively gives them the emission factor that they can then use and associate with that product. And if they're creating compound products, then they can kind of aggregate that up on a mass balance spread to create the emission factor for their compound feed. So that then, when that feed goes into the supply chain to feed livestock, then that emission factor for that feed can go with the assessments as part of that livestock. And livestock, from my perspective, is a critical part of the food value chain. And I know there's big debates about this, but I think livestock is part of a sustainable mixed farming system where arable crops and perennial crops can benefit from the presence of animals within the cropping system. So I think, animal feed, animals are all part of a healthy, diverse food system, and so that protein flow from the crops through the animals and then into human consumption is a critical part. And the Cool Farm tool can be used to help quantify those emissions at that sort of feed growth stage and then the animal livestock growth stage as well. And clearly, the Cool Farm calculation is only at farm level, so it then doesn't flow on through the broader supply chain, but the output data can be tagged into the assessment and the product data as it goes through the supply chain. So I think databases such as like GFLI's database, it's really important that they stay independent and not for profit. As soon as for profit gets involved, then you can start losing the credibility of the data set, because they see it as their own IP, they see it, they need to protect it in some way. You lose something on transparency, and then usually the pricing then becomes non-competitive as well. So I would absolutely strongly recommend that this stays as a not-for-profit industry collaboration, as a channel to get authentic, credible data to the marketplace. There's an awful lot of new money coming into this, creating that competitive marketplace. A lot of that is trying to make money, obviously, out of farming systems, the supply chain. And frankly, if there's one part of the sector of the global economic sector, farming is the ones put upon the most. The last thing we need is to create more profiteering within the farming sector, which makes it very difficult for farmers and those people trying to help and support farmers become more sustainable and resilient. So the GFLI secretary have been a pleasure to work with over the years. Good people, knowledgeable, very personable and professional to work with. So delightful.
So thank you, Richard, for participating in the Voices of GFLI. We're very happy to hear your point of view.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for tuning in to Voices of GFLI. If you're inspired by what you've heard, be sure to follow us and explore more stories from across the Global Feed community. Together, we're driving transparency, collaboration, and sustainable change. One conversation at a time.